Hi folks, you're with Tassless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio, audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you're driving along in your car or your truck, or put in those earbuds and listen to it in public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how the drift from political ideologies that were quite separate among the major parties and had been for many decades, how these major political parties across the Western world, at least, began to drift towards the centre. Now, they had a lot of encouragement and inducement from what today we would call the globalists, but nonetheless, given that how different the political ideologies were, one side leaning towards socialism, the other side leaning towards capitalism, and why those differences of political ideology and methodology, by the way, you have a political ideology, then how do you enact that? How do you achieve it, on the ground or on the street? How do you deliver it? And there were considerable differences in methodology as well as ideology. But this is all changed. Today, the major parties, whether you look in Australia or the United States or Britain or Canada, there's very little difference between the major parties. Every now and again, a party leader may pop up who suggests or implies there's some difference, but then when it comes down to it, they still end up supporting the same mass migration, the Green New Deal, and all these sort of things that make our lives in the West difficult and miserable and have destroyed our living standards. Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom was a classic case. He got quite a serious majority in Parliament because he was seen as a gadfly, an outsider. He would deliver Brexit. He would stop the illegal immigration. He would cut back on the illegal migration. He would fix these problems. This outsider, this gadfly. Turns out he was one of the biggest globalist flunky stooge gobblers that there was, and he delivered handsomely plus on all of the globalist requirements. And treacherously, in my view, stabbed the British people in the back as he delivered these globalist things while pretending or inferring that he would do otherwise. Britain is a basket case, or heading towards being a basket case today, and the Conservatives and Boris Johnson, I think in particular, can take the very undeserved credit for that. Now, let's go back to the 1970s, where an Australian, in 1972, I think it was, an Australian Socialist Party came to power, and they were enacting, a lot of what we would call today, socialist policies. They wanted equal outcomes for women. This Marxist idea of education is the great equaliser. But of course, it's difficult to produce equal outcomes with education, given that students have different capacities, different brain powers, different commitment, different attention spans, and so on. So it's all very well to talk about equal. Education is great. Everyone's going to have an education. Everyone's going to be equal, and so on. But in the end, the only thing they can really do to achieve this utopian concept of equality is simply to lower standards. And that's the only way they can create equality, and also engage in tokenism. Well, a PhD is someone who's got a PhD is respected and revered, and they have all the accolades and so on. So because of that, why don't we give everyone a PhD? Problem solved, equality all round. So they always default to that sort of the quick fix. Well, let's give everyone a PhD. Let's lower the standard, or let's lower the bar so that everyone gets a high school diploma, and the list just goes on. Entrance to university was a very tough gig, certainly when I graduated from senior high school. But not many people, like 3% or something of the kids that started high school made it. So what do? Well, we just lower the standards so that anyone can make it. And we'll just create all sorts of bullshit courses at universities, like peace studies, so that anyone can get into university, and anyone can say they've got a university degree because the university degree means something. Well, yeah, but if you give it to everybody just through lower standards rather than rigorous education, it ends up meaning nothing, which of course is where university degrees are today. but nonetheless, let's just have a look at this. The Labor Party, as it's called in Australia, they're like the Democrats in the US. They were very pro-union and these sorts of things, and pro social services and pro all sorts of cherished social programs and these sorts of things, and maybe the intentions are good, to create, to help people at the bottom and that sort of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I am someone who's in favour of that, but not if it's used simply to lower standards. Not if it's used to entrench long-term victimhood and things like that. Then I think it becomes counterproductive. But there was a move to put in place these, like the migrant programs, the equality programs, equity programs, which we see that are on super steroids today. At the time, they were to help the genuinely disadvantaged, but you could see the architecture of equal outcomes was already there. It wasn't there as in your face as it is now or later became, but that sort of sentiment was there. And the 1960s communists and socialists, they believed that if we can get into the institutions such as education, and this was often done through trade unions as an entry point, if we can get into these institutions, then we can change them from within. And so there was what's called the Long March through the institutions, where socialists were getting in there and hiring each other and promoting each other. Now there should have been the oversight there to stop that. Anyone who's in charge of whether it be a public service department or whatever would be moving actively to prevent that and to stop it, and to say, well, we want people who are going to be teachers, not activists. And so there should have been that level but somehow that oversight failed universally across the Western world. So you've got to assume that they must have had inside help at quite senior levels. Having been again in like an EVP, a VP, and a CEO of smaller businesses, less than 300 people type thing. Then you always have to be alert to not infiltration by political activists, although there's that too, but more you want to get a bunch of people coming in who all know each other and think the system should be rigged in their favour. For example, there was a lady was hired who was a well-connected socialite, and I didn't hire her. The CEO insisted on hiring her at this place, and then she actively lobbied to get all her buddies, her socialite, wealthy socialite buddies hired and given key positions simply because of their social status and the social prestige they enjoyed and the waterfront mansions they lived in, this sort of thing. And I spotted that and stopped it, actively went to stop it. Not because, these people were actually useless, but or worse than useless in some cases. But the idea that a little cabal can be set up inside the company, or in this case, a company, and then they can make their own rules and suit themselves and decide what will and won't be. And this sort of no, that's not going to happen, guys. So I actively intercepted that and stopped it. And it wasn't a big deal to stop it. All you had to do was enforce rules of merit. The best qualified person is hired, not your buddy from, fucking high school or something like that, unless they turn out to be the most, which they never did or never were. Not that they weren't, well turned out and charming and well spoken. They were, but they were just useless at doing any work. So this idea that this infiltration could take place and no one knew or no one could see it, or I don't accept that. I think it had help from pretty high up. So we've got to assume that the globalists had already established a network of people at government level and within the party political machinery level. They'd already done that before they started inserting their activists throughout the public service and through government quangos, those sorts of things. So if you look at say British Labour as an example, they were pretty radically socialist. And if you look up leaders like Michael Foot and that sort of thing, and when they were looking at leaders like Neil Kinnock, for example, he seemed to have more internal battles with his own radical left wing than he did fighting the Tories. This is in 1960s here. This socialist government, they started introducing special protections for pregnant women in the workplace. Now, at that stage, not many women worked, so it was an unusual boutique thing to do. But those protections for pregnant women, they became a big issue when the number of women in the workforce starts to increase. So you've got 20% of women in the workforce, and they're only there for a short time anyway. And typically a few years before they got married and had a family. And then you get a situation where the birth rate drops, few women are having children, and so they're in the workforce for longer periods of time. And there's this support for pregnant women, but given the number of women in the workforce has now substantially increased as we move into the 70s and 80s. The special protections for pregnant women, such as guaranteeing their job when they come back, this sort of thing, those suddenly start to bite quite hard. So it's all very well to say, well, we'll help the one in 100 women who wants to come back to work after having children. But suddenly when there's 30 out of 100 women who want to come back to work after having children, through economic necessity as much as anything, then that changes the whole context and the whole effect of the implementation of things like special assistance for homosexuals. Already in the 1960s, there was quite a radical teachers movement to help homosexual, not so much lesbian in the day, but homosexual children. So they had special squads then identifying homosexual children, and it was quite a big thing among teachers' unions in the 1960s, and of course since then, where today they've got special sort of lesbian identifier squads and support squads that go around to the schools for a girl who's even suspected of being a lesbian, even if she isn't. They'll descend upon her and try and sort of coax her and encourage her into being a lesbian, because their existence depends on how many lesbians they've supposedly identified. So they've got a serious skin in the game there of trying to identify as many lesbians as they can. Similarly, there was employment protections and other protections for a very small number of black people that were in the United Kingdom at the time. A very small number of those were working, and many of them were just from the Caribbean, for example, or Africa, were completely unskilled labourers. There was already discussion in the 70s, more discussion and lower level implementation, but here's how it creeps through. Gender quotas. So trade unions were already in the 70s, late 60s and early 70s, were very much saying, well, instead of having a union delegate to represent you, you had to have a male and a female union delegate. And they were, the unions were quite heavily, teachers' unions in particular, were quite heavily promoting that. And then say, well, we also need then a lesbian and a gay union delegate. And they started to break, and a black union delegate. They started already in the unions. They were breaking it down by race, gender, and sexuality. This is in the early 1970s. That was already happening then in some of these trade unions, such as the teachers' unions. So again, we can already see that architecture starting to take hold, and moving from economic Marxism, taking over the means of production and this sort of thing, nationalising industries, which the leftist parties tended to do. So moving from economic Marxism, which had been the main problem, this had been the big bugbear of business, because if a leftist sort of Marxist leaning government came in, they would do all this state owning the means of production, taxing wealth in such a way, and trying to equalise economic outcomes. And this was something that business always had a bugbear with. So, well, look, can't you guys at least agree on the general direction of the economy? Because we don't like this stop-start business. And and the noise or the voices coming, certainly by the later 70s, and definitely into the 80s, the message that the left-wing parties like the Labor Party in Britain, or even in Australia, the message they were putting out was, you need not fear a leftist government because economically we're the same as those guys. There's no difference. So you can, you don't have to hide your money under the mattress or something. You can leave it in the bank. We're not going to have anything different from the way the capitalist-leaning guys do. So they switched at this point. I noticed the pivot from economic Marxism to social Marxism. So we're not going to try and achieve equal outcomes economically. We're going to try to achieve equal outcomes socially. So it was turned from economic Marxism to social Marxism. That's where I think the primary pivot came. But a lot of the building blocks were already in place. The trade unions, for example, on this, let's have multiple delegates, one to represent the lesbians, one to represent the blacks, and this sort of thing, the women. So the architecture for race, gender hustling was already in place. And it was in place through the trade unions and through the education system. Not so much outside of that, but you could see it also permeating the welfare-related agencies and gradually other government agencies. Now, as the number of quangos and NGOs exploded, certainly in the over the last 20-odd years, then a lot of the people, if not all of the people that were in these NGOs and quangos, they were from the unions and the education department. They were from the same group of activists, which really were all through the public services and the university system and the education system. They just moved them across to the NGOs and the like and the quangos. So really they were just sharing their activists around into other. Now, at the same time as you've got that going on, you've got the globalists, the economic globalists are coming in from the other side. So you've got this social Marxism coming in on one side, and the other side you've got the globalist thing happening, and it's often easy to mistake that for socialism, because in a sort of a way it is. But bear in mind, in the Soviet system, the Soviet Union, you had a small elite that were living like kings. They were eating caviar and so on, while the masses were eating potato bread or something like that. But there was a chasm of difference in between the lifestyle of the elites and the ideological enablers. If you're a school teacher teaching Marxist theory, for example, at school, college, you were treated like a senior official in a company. You had a nice apartment, access to the good shops with all the Western goods, access to Western movies, access to nice annual vacations and so on and so forth. But if you were a doctor or a factory engineer or something, you were just a piece of shit. You were ideologically, you were irrelevant to the revolution. Sure, you produced widgets, and that's good in its way, but ideology is what the real issue is. And we see this with the globalists now. Whilst they use it for their own enrichment, but the what we would call the globalists today, back in the 60s and 70s, were saying that we're looking at what is the new economic frontier. So there's been absolute boom since the end of the Second World War. The rebuilding after the war and the American funding of for loans for expansion. Between 1945, Germany was bombed quite heavily, and their economy was in ruins. Yet by 1960, just 14 years later, the German economy was bigger than the British economy. That gives you an idea just how quickly Germany recovered, and they were selling Mercs and BMWs and everything all over the world. So the globalists were looking at, well, where's the next economic frontier? We've exhausted the post-war boom. We're moving more women into the workforce, so we've, that boom's got limited potential. It'll lower wages or lower the growth of wages. It'll increase. It'll also be a basis for undermining the trade unions in a very indirect way, which is, I think, part of the encouragement process there. And the globalists were looking, well, where's the next economic frontier? We want to have high profits and guaranteed high profits and very low risk. And you see that attitude today in the public-private partnerships, where the big financial end of town, they don't want any fucking risk, and they want absolutely super normal profit returns, which is really theft from the citizens via the government and the tax pool, the tax money pool. So they were looking at this and saying, well, where will the next sort of thing come from? And it was moving women into the workforce, and then moving third world peasant labour into I'm simplifying a bit here, but moving third world peasant labour into the West, because the Western economic zones you can control, whereas the third world basket cases, there just isn't the infrastructure to control it. So any money you give is wasted corruptly and achieves and produces and creates nothing. Whereas in the West, where that advanced infrastructure does exist, not only through the media, but then you've got a degree of control, as the globalists would see it, that allows you then to treat all the Western nations as puppets, and the globalists as the puppet masters, which is, of course, where we are today. So you've got a very small elite, and Nigel Farage in Britain sort of touched on this by talking about corporatism, where we don't have capitalism anymore, or certainly not in any sense that we've understood it. Socialism or Marxism as a social construct we have, but not as an economic construct anymore. Although I think we'll return to that through the idea of everyone gets the same low wage and we all become serfs again. I think it'll do the full loop back to that eventually. I think that's certainly where we're headed, assuming the current trajectory continues. But the idea of the globalists was to create a situation where there were mass consuming groups or economic zones where the consumption wasn't discretionary consumer goods. The consumption was the essentials of life, accommodation, food, water, that sort of stuff, travel. So that they would own the globalists would own all the essentials of life in monopoly style structures, and you'd be forced to pay extortionate rates for access to those minimal services. I always used as a kid, and I always used to wonder about these dystopian future sci-fi movies where they'd have super advanced technology, super space age technology, warp speed this and so that, but they'd have depictions of people dressed in rags breaking up rocks while in chains, while there were brutal guards beating them up and that sort of stuff. And I was thinking, well, how ridiculous! How could a society that advanced, technologically advanced, why would they have people breaking up rocks when they could just pull out a few laser beams or something and they could create all the broken rocks they wanted? But I missed the point, assuming that was even the point of those dystopian movies, where crushing people's will through constant humiliation and degradation of the capable, though. You're not crushing the will of the incapable, because they're pretty much already crushed. It's crushing the will of the most capable and denigrating the most capable. That's where it is. And so I think that's where, those dystopian movies there, that's where we are today. The globalists are hell-bent, whether it's through mass media or you have to respect the LGBTQ flag, and if you don't, we'll throw you in prison. But if you want to burn 100 American flags or British flags, that's fine. Or you want to fly the Palestinian flag, that's okay. But you want to fly the British flag in London, then the police will descend on you and arrest you. It's that sort of humiliation, degradation. And that's what's going on today, not to the extent of having to break up the rocks, but it's that concept of an advanced technological society using effectively medieval methods of crushing and so on, undermining and humiliating, the equivalent of the stocks or something like that. So you've got the globalists coming in from the other side, trying to create these monopolies, these economic zones, changing the very structure of what was once capitalism, and again calling that corporatism. The political parties and the political machines were all bought off with, dazzling real estate deals, the big financial end of town and so on. These guys were employing the offspring and the relatives and the friends of the politicians, giving them very exceptionally well-paid, cozy jobs, and these politicians were more than happy to sell out their fellow citizens. Now, on the matter of class, something I noticed was I was doing a lot of business traveling. I would be, I could be in, I don't know, France, Belgium, Germany, wherever, America, Canada, and so on, any English-speaking country, but also non-English-speaking countries or advanced Western economies at least. And I'd find that I had more in common with middle-class people from, downtown Paris, for example. I had more in common with them, or anywhere really around the Western world, more in common with other middle-class people, of my level of education and those sorts of things, than I did with people in my own, working class people or people in my own country. So if I go to some of the poorest suburbs, say of Sydney, if I go to some of the poorest suburbs of Sydney, I've got nothing in common with those people. We speak the same language, we have the same, religion background, and all that sort of stuff. That's the same. We've been through the same school system, that type of thing. But I've got nothing in common with them, or hardly anything. I have to consciously adjust the way I talk and speak and the things that I talk about if I'm going to relate to them. They can't change what they are, so I have to make the change in order to get any sort of social connection there. And so I've got more in common with the middle class guy in Paris, or the middle class guy in Vancouver or London, or I don't know, Brussels. I'm thinking of places, all the places I've been in, Brussels and so on. Now, a middle class guy or the equivalent of middle class guy, say in somewhere like Indonesia, for example, or in I don't know, Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur or something, then no, I don't have that same, or in Tokyo, I don't have that same similarity. There is, a decent amount of relating to one another, I guess you could say. But again, the difference between relating to a middle-class guy in Tokyo, assuming his English is decent enough, because I can hardly speak any Japanese, is it's still a toss-up as to whether or not I can relate to him more effectively than I can to my fellow citizen from a poor area. Or conversely, I find it hard to relate to people today who maybe they're not necessarily hugely wealthy, but they've become public servants or something at straight out of university, and they've got a job for life, and they're good globalist enablers, and they are paid very handsomely. 500,000, 600,000, 800,000 a year, that sort of income range. And I find I've got very little in common with them. Oh, no, I shouldn't say. There is a lot in common, but our beliefs diverge. We actually have quite a bit in common, but our beliefs diverge. I think mass migration is ruinous to the West. They think, or claim to think, it's wonderful, but they suffer none of its negative effects and don't perceive any of their negative effects. And they don't think anything outside of, 1 or 2 days or a week or two ahead, and they see no problem. And as quite a few wealthy people with their waterfront managers have said to me, they want mass migration, they want to increase it, but they don't want those people anywhere near me. I don't want those people anywhere near my house. I don't want them anywhere near my daughter. I don't want them anywhere near my wife. I don't want them in my street. So only because they're through their wealth, only because they're able to live very separately from these mass migrants, third world peasants. Only because of that are they in agreement. If they had to put up with it up close every day, then I'm sure they would see it differently. So I just wanted to talk about that shift and that change, and how it happened, because it crept up on us without really noticing. And when I first started noticing the globalization thing, I had to check myself, because I kept saying there's no way our politicians would allow that. There's no way our courts, our independent courts would ever tolerate this. And so I took that view that we were, as a society, very well protected, because the West was a high trust society. It wasn't perfect in every way, but it was a high trust society. I trusted our politicians would never allow something like this to happen. I trusted our judges and independent courts would never succumb to the sort of nonsense, the activist nonsense that they do today. I thought our public services will never allow such and such, and and so on and so forth. Our universities will never allow an affirmative action program to permit low IQ black lesbians to come in and then be awarded degrees just for turning up. They'll never do it. And so I believe that all these safeguards were in place, but in fact they weren't, or they were dismantled, and they were dismantled gradually, which is the long march through the institutions. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this. You've been with Tassifs today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.